Hey everyone, welcome back to the podcast. I'm Eric Barnes, your host, and with me today is James Titcumb, who has a cool new PHP project. So, welcome to the show, James. And if you don't mind, just kind of give us a quick intro about yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me on the show for starters. My name's James Titcumb. I've been writing PHP stuff since around 2002. Programming since before that is something I've always enjoyed. Became a bit of an open source contributor. And a couple of years ago, I was approached to join the PHP Foundation and work on this cool new PHP project.
So, awesome. That's awesome. Yeah. So the new project is called PHP Pie. And I guess probably the easiest way to start with this is, can you give us sort of the quick little elevator pitch on, what this is and what it's trying to accomplish?
Absolutely, yeah. So Pi is essentially, if you've heard of PECL before, Pi is a replacement for PECL. And PECL and Pi are tools that you can use to install PHP extensions. So, if you need additional functionality that, maybe MySQL or there's some extensions are kind of built into PHP, like JSON and things like that. They are, usually included with PHP, but they are still extensions. So what Pi aims to do is to overhaul PECL, complete rewrite and modernization, use Composer under the hood, all this kind of stuff to make a tool that's going to be useful and sort of got a good future, essentially. Because PECL, for those of you who don't know, it was basically part of the PHAR project, and PHAR is like this ancient predecessor to Composer, essentially. And there's many people today who just haven't even heard of PECL, PHAR, and maybe not even PECL as well. We're trying to modernize the tooling around that and infrastructure, in fact, as well. So the short version is it's the new way of installing your PHP extensions. There's a lot of work going into it. The PHP Foundation, as I said, picked me up to start working on this. We're trying to use as much existing knowledge about things that we learnt, when the community was introduced to Composer. Like, wow, this is vastly different to anything we've had before. We're not just copy pasting classes into our code base anymore, or using PHAR and so on, as I mentioned. Part of it is also funded by the Sovereign Tech Agency, which is a German government department who their main interest is sort of ensuring the longevity and maintainability of the open source ecosystem. And they're one of the PHP Foundation sponsors, among many others, of course. They are particularly interested in certain projects, and Pi is one of those. Because we need to make sure there's a good future, and that's sort of obviously the goal of the PHP Foundation is to make sure that we've got people working on PHP. We can ensure the future and longevity of the language. This aligns very much with one of the goals of the PHP Foundation. So that's where we are with this.
Well, where was there like a tipping point, a few years ago where you just ran into some problem and you're like, there has to be a better way? Or sort of like, how did this come about, going from the PECL to this?
So, I think it's a gradual thing. PHAR, for example, was started back in 1999, I think. PECL not long after that. And both the tool and the websites that drive these projects are not very well maintained anymore. Part of the frustration was, having to maintain the infrastructure for that. There's a pecl.php.net website, for example. We have to keep maintenance on that. But, the code base isn't modern by any standards. There's a lot that could be done to bring that up to modern times. So, in my professional career, you know, I quite often say, oh, we shouldn't just like rewrite everything from scratch. But that is in fact what we're doing here. But we're not really rewriting it from scratch, right? We're using Composer. The infrastructure is going to be on Packagist, or already is on Packagist rather. Geordie and Nils and the Packagist team have been super helpful in, you know, being able to help us to integrate Pi into Packagist. And if you find a Pi extension now on Packagist, it's got like all the metadata associated with it, like is it thread safe, not thread safe, what versions of PHP it supports, and all this kind of stuff. And that's all nicely integrated into Packagist now with their help. So, you know, we're using the existing stuff that's already there rather than rewriting it from scratch, which is really nice because, you know, the engine that drives Pi essentially is Composer. So the way you use it, the way it works, should be fairly familiar to most of us now. So it's, you know, again, sort of taking those modernization techniques. You know, we've built it in a way that's hopefully a lot more maintainable long term. You know, we've used a few libraries, although we try not to use too many, just because having lots of dependencies can make it difficult to work on like various versions of PHP and so on. But, you know, we've got like the Laravel container, for example, drives like the service location in the software. We've got Composer that does all the downloading, dependency resolution, all this kind of stuff. You know, downloading those packages, the zip files, and that's all provided out the box. So, you know, that part of it was straightforward. And really what we're trying to do is, you know, modernize everything around installing an extension, because actually installing an extension is super easy, right? You grab the source code, you run PHPI's configure, make, and make install, and then you have an extension, hopefully, if it compiles. But, you know, it's all the stuff around that, like making sure it works on your PHP version, making sure you've got the libraries that you might need for that extension. You know, we're working towards trying to make that a lot easier as well than PECL ever could do. And it's definitely an uphill battle, but, you know, we're taking a look around at the other tools that are available. Like, you know, the Docker PHP infrastructure is great, for example. You know, you can just say, oh, I want, you know, libcurl, and it makes sure it's got all the libraries and so on. So we're trying to sort of, get the PHP tooling up to speed with that.
Gotcha. Well, would it, is the goal ever to just have this into like native compiled PHP? Like, I know like right now, like this is just like you install PHP, but then you have to go and install Composer and you have to go install Pi. Is there ever going to be like a drive, you know, maybe from the foundation or anybody to just sort of have all this into one? Like if you have PHP on your machine, you already have all this stuff that you're going to need, or is that are you thinking it's more should always be separated?
No, that's a really good question. It's one that comes up a few times actually. And I get asked two different ways of the same question, or a similar question, right? Oh, why don't we bundle this as part of Composer? Because, you know, you say it uses Composer. And also, why don't we bundle this with PHP? Which PECL is at the moment. Like if you, download like a default install of PHP, PECL and PHAR is actually usually built in there. You can sort of configure it without it and so on. But typically when it's distributed, it does have PECL and PHAR because they are still used, you know, certainly PECL, less so much PHAR with Composer. But there's a couple of reasons. There's two answers. So the first one about, you know, why don't we just make this part of Composer? Well, the key difference in a PHP extension and a PHP package, like a library that you install, is the PHP extension becomes part of the PHP executable itself. So you can only have like one set of extensions for that whole PHP install. And you know, if you're installing things in like a Docker environment where you've probably only got one project anyway, and so you've got one version of PHP, well, that kind of it muddies the waters a bit because you've only got one thing anyway. So why not make it the same? But in theory, you know, you could run a machine with lots of different projects running PHP, and they might all be using the same version of PHP, and so they would all be using the same extensions as well. So, if when you use Composer, you're expecting to install dependencies into a specific project rather than like your whole PHP install. And Pi is the opposite. It is designed only to install extensions into the version of PHP that you're running. And it does support multiple versions of PHP if you've got more than one installed on your machine. And so there's that difference there. Like extensions installed into PHP, your Composer packages are installed into your project. And a following question I get quite a lot from that is, well, why can we make extensions part of the project? And that is definitely something I'd like to look into. It's would need a bit of work on PHP itself to make work efficiently, because yes, in theory it's possible to do and it's quite easy, but you're going to suffer a lot of performance because you're going to be loading and unloading an extension every time you get a request. And since certainly the days of PHP 5, the language is so much faster now that everything runs a lot faster, and it's one of the fastest interpreted languages there is now, except maybe JavaScript and so on. But we don't want to take a step back from that by making a change that could damage the performance essentially. So it's something I definitely want to look at, but that's maybe a medium long-term project. The other side of the question was, well, why don't we bundle that with PHP? Why don't we bundle Pi with PHP? And that's something I'd like to do again in the future. The reason why I wouldn't do that right now is because we want to move fast and keep iterating and developing Pi. As bugs come, get reported and so on, I want to fix them as quick as possible, get new releases out. And if we tie up the release cadence of Pi into the PHP release cadence, we're not going to be able to move as fast. So right now, there is potential for, maybe putting an installer script in with PHP itself. That's something totally feasible. I just didn't get around to it yet. And it's something I'd like to do again. But I wouldn't chuck Pi into the PHP distribution itself, at least for now, just so we can keep moving fast and improving things and fixing things if they come up.
That makes perfect sense. And I wasn't even thinking about that because the PHP is is it once a year for?
There's several
longer, right?
Patch releases every now and then. Especially like security fixes and so on. We try and rush those out as soon as possible. But certainly like a minor release, I think they're like once a year. That sounds about right. I think it's usually released around November. I can't remember the dates exactly, so don't quote me on that one.
November 20th this year, because we just had a post about it yesterday. Because I was like, I remember the date. Which talking about security too. You were talking about sort of PHP security, but for security on this, because you're sort of using the packages composer ecosystem, like that should help with all of that, right? As far as like any sort of security issues with any of these things that you're installing, basically will be taken care of through all that, so you don't have to worry too much, right?
Yeah, I mean, and actually, I think there's certainly a lot of attention now on supply chain and where all of our source code that is running in applications actually comes from. I know the folks at Composer have been looking into this, and I'm hoping that any changes they make, we'll be able to use similar techniques for securing the supply chain and so on automatically, just by nature of the fact we're using Composer. We do some funny things for some extensions. They might provide like pre-packaged source code, for example, because they might depend on some other libraries, and they might bundle those libraries up. And MongoDB extension is a great example of this. They pull in a few different libraries using Git submodules, and historically, when they make a PECL release, they make that release on their machine, whereas Pi, because it works in the same way as Composer does, it grabs the zip archive from GitHub or whatever source control, GitLab that you're using, for example. It won't have those Git submodules initialized. So we're like, okay, well, can we make your extension use prepackaged source code? So there is slight deviation from the way Composer downloads things for certain extensions. We've configured it so that if you define this setting in your Pi configuration, then it will download a specific named archive containing the source code and compile that instead. There's things we need to make sure are buttoned up longer term for sure. With relation to security and supply chain and so on. But good steps have already been made in Pi itself. Like when you self update. Rather than like checking the hash of the file that we've done, we're using this SigStore attestation system, which is where when we build the FAR file in the GitHub action, it sends it signs the build provenance basically and says, okay, this is where this FAR file was built. And then when you download that FAR file, you can do like Pi self verify. Or you can use GH attestation verify, and there's some parameters that you give it, and say, can you tell me that this is genuine? And it will check the signatures and so on against various systems. And we've actually, as a result of this, made a separate open source library on the PHP Foundation. It's the PHPF/attestation, which is a starting point for PHP being able to do these kind of attestations and verification of build targets and things like that, which is pretty cool.
So how long did it take you to go from like idea to like a first sort of like basic working version? Was this a pretty quick process for you as far as like a developer, or was it a lot of stuff behind the scenes that you had to learn and do before you got there?
I think initially, the planning for this started back in October 2023, so a couple of years now, really. We were just kind of sketching out like, what do we want to do? What do we want at least the first iteration of this thing to look like? I actually started developing on this January 2024, I think the first release we made was around October 2024. So again, like a year ago or so now. I guess about 9 months of that was spent picking a name for the project, because that's always the hardest thing, right? No, I'm kidding. It was, we went through a lot of iterations as well. Like the first version of it didn't really use Composer very much. And then we sort of overhauled it as well. As Geordie gave me some guidance and like pointed me in the right direction, whereas what can I do? How can I actually sort of fit this build process into Pi and how it all works together? So the actual like first like stable release, if you like, was June of this year, June 2025. We've been working on some nice features since then. So it's overall, so far, been about 2 years, including sort of planning and, thinking about what we wanted to look like, doing some prototyping and so on. But it's been an interesting journey for sure.
That's awesome. So going back to PECL for a second. I guess the sort of the long-term plan is to sort of deprecate PECL and just sort of move it in legacy, sort of the way PHAR is, or any of those old things.
So hot news, in fact. In September, we actually officially deprecated PECL. So that went through as an RFC. It was fairly straightforward, just saying like, we're not actually changing anything yet. PECL is still usable. Everything will still continue working for the time being. But now we're officially saying, okay, let's start using Pi. Longer term, we're going to probably sunset the website, maybe start making it read only at some point. Again, I don't know what the timeline is going to be for this. But eventually, it'll all be made read only. So PECL will still work. You just won't be able to make any new releases on it. And then eventually, hopefully, the long tail will die off, and then we can turn off those servers. PHAR, interestingly, on the other hand, there's right now there's an active discussion on the mailing list around that particular thing. I thought it would be as straightforward as just, oh yeah, we'll do the same sort of thing with PHAR, and we'll just say, oh, it's deprecated, but carry on working. Apparently that's not the case. PHAR is actually a completely separate group in theory from PHP, except the thing that ties it up to PHP is, one, we bundle PHAR with PHP, and two, the PHAR website is on phar.php.net. So it looks like, at least from the outsider's perspective, it's part of PHP. But in reality, that's not the case. So I've made a bit of a faux pas trying to open that RFC. But there's some discussion going on at the moment. We're trying to get in touch with like the people who maintain that. And, hopefully we can sort of point people in the direction of Composer now. Because I know that's been sort of a long-standing thing, like, oh, why doesn't PHP just say, go and use Composer? Which, in my opinion, and obviously that's just my opinion, it should be. So, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Well, that's sort of, it's completely off topic, but are there any other like obscure PHP things that still exist that sort of are sort of forgotten about? Kind of like PHAR. Like for me, I haven't thought about PHAR in, it feels like 15 years. But is there anything else out there like that that's still sort of out and around and just kind of forgotten?
Oh, probably. I wouldn't know, to be honest. But I mean, that's kind of the point, isn't it? If everyone's forgotten about it, it might still be there. But no, I can't think of anything off my head.
So going forward, do you have a bunch of features you're still going to try to integrate, or are you getting pretty close to having it kind of where you think it should be? For the next 5 years or so, or is still kind of changing as people start adopting? Yeah,
there's still loads to do, I think. I kind of mentioned earlier, I think one of the biggest things for me is, being able to install an extension without worrying like, oh, I need to get my build stack up and running and I need to install this library, and knowing how to do that on each platform. I run Ubuntu on my workstation, and quite often in Docker images. So I know, if I want to install the curl extension, I know I need to install like libcurl through whatever apt package. And I know that, but if I'm trying to use a Fedora system, I might think, oh, okay, I don't know what the package name is in Yum or DNF or something to be able to install libcurl. And so what I want to try and do is when you do like Pi install whatever the extension is, as long as the extension maintainer has said, oh, I need this particular library, I want Pi to be able to say, oh, okay, I need to install this, and you're using apt, so I'll install apt install whatever this particular package is. Or if you're using Yum, I need to install Yum, install whatever this package is, and so on. And same with APK and DNF and so on, like at least the common package managers, because that's, I think for me, like a low hanging fruit there. Like we can improve that experience, and make, take that pain away from people just wanting to use an extension. Oh, I need to use this extension, but I've got to figure out all this other stuff before it. And I also mentioned like the Docker image as well, that it kind of does that already, which is nice. And so we want to be able to emulate that, but, for all platforms or as many platforms as possible. It's not an easy task though, because you have to, like, for example, you have to know what the library is called in each one of those package managers. And so, there's a fair amount of research got to go into that, looking up, what libraries are called what in what package managers, making sure that we've got the build tool chains like autoconf, make and GCC and all that kind of stuff to actually build the extensions, and so on. So I want to make that part of it a lot easier. At the moment, it's, roughly on par with what PECL does. It expects you to have those already there. But, that's one of the big features I want to try and improve. And, there's plenty more in the pipeline, some cool stuff to try and hopefully make extension installing like this no-brainer thing like Composer is now,
Awesome. All right. So this is more of a personal, like you as the creator. Do you have sort of a favorite like feature of Pi so far, or do you just like the whole thing in general?
No, that's a great question. I think certainly one of the game-changing features for me that PECL never had was If your current directory is in a PHP project and you run just py install, nothing else, it will look at the extensions that project needs and checks if they're installed. If not, it will offer to, it will search Packagist for that extension and offer, do you want to install this extension? That's, one step closer to that usability thing where, this project needs extension A, B, and C. Okay, I've got to install PECL install A, PECL install B, PECL install C. Whereas with Py, you can just do py install and it will go and try its best to find them for you and offer to install. For me, that's a game changer. I think it's one of those usability things which I can see is already driving adoption, because that seems to be what most people are using. They're just sort of going to their PHP project, running py install, and not worrying about like what the extensions are called and so on, which is great. That's kind of the goal with that particular feature.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that part's going to be great because, I just remember, I'm trying to remember the obscure extensions I used to have to install back in the day, and I'm sort of drawing a blank, but I seem to remember something around like mail or pop or something, but I could be totally, it's been so long. How about you? What's the most obscure extension you've ever used?
I think the most fun, they're usually as a result of like Sarah Goldman working on things, stuff like RunKit, and there's another similar one for being able to change what's loaded in the PHP language and stuff. Obviously, these are not made for production. I can't remember what the other one was called. It's annoying me now. But you can use RunKit to unload functions and things like that, which typically you shouldn't be doing. And your mileage may vary, but they're certainly fun extensions. I don't know how well maintained they are these days, but they're certainly around. They're quite interesting to play with, at least.
Yeah, that's awesome. All right, so if someone's never used Py yet, they're listening, what's the one thing you want them to remember as they're getting started?
I think the biggest thing to remember is that I am trying to provide as much support as I can for people onboarding onto this. Whether they're an extension maintainer who want to adopt Py as well as PECL, or someone who just doesn't really know much about extensions and they just want to install extensions. There is the Py GitHub, which is on github.com/php/Py. There is discussion groups. You can ask Q&A. There are issues if you encounter bugs and so on. I'm trying to be as responsive as I can to things that come up. I might need a few hours to think of an answer, but certainly I'll try and get back to people and help as much as possible. Even if it's a silly question, just go ahead and ask, because it may help others anyway. Because other people may have the same question.
Yeah, true. What about contributors? Are you asking for help for anything or needing help for anything right now, or is it pretty much?
Yeah, I mean the biggest way to help at the moment is to replace PECL where you're using it and try and use Py, and let us know where it's working and not working. And give us feedback. That's the biggest help at the moment. Because we've got the roadmap, we know what we're working on. And we just want to make sure that onboarding is as easy as possible. And, people aren't encountering bugs or like issues where they're like, oh, well, I can't use Py because XYZ. Okay, well, let's work on fixing that. So getting that feedback to the repo, whether it's a discussion or issue, is the absolute most helpful thing that folks can do at the moment.
Sweet, I love it. All right, so now this is my last section of notes. Rapid fire questions. Let's see if these end up any good or not. If they're terrible, we'll just cut this out of the podcast. What's the first PHP extension you ever installed?
Oh, that's going to be going back a long way. I mean, technically, the first PHP extension we all install is like the standard library that comes with PHP, because most people know. Sorry, I know this is meant to be quickfire, but most people don't know actually. Most of the stuff, like the functions we use in PHP, are actually extensions. There's like a standard extension, which always comes with PHP. There's a few other which have always come with PHP, and some which have now moved into always coming with PHP, like Opcache, is now always going to be bundled with PHP 8.5 when it gets released next month. So,
and last one I have. All right, this is a personal question. One thing you'd change about the PHP ecosystem if you could?
Oh, that's a tough one. I love the PHP ecosystem, right? I made a lot of good friends, met a lot of nice people in my time, and community is a really great thing with PHP, and since the explosion, if you like, of Laravel, it's just been made even better. I think there's such a mixture of knowledge and viewpoints, and it's great. It does result, as you've probably seen in the past, in debates, which can sometimes be heated. But I wouldn't change a lot, to be quite honest. It's a great community. Maybe not a perfect language, but it doesn't matter because you're still productive, you're still getting things done, and because it's so well used, you can get so much help and support from the community, your colleagues, and so on. And it's just, I don't see the same level in other languages by any means, but maybe less of the angry arguments. But that's about it, really.
Well, I think that's just all developers want to argue about something. So this is just our outlet to argue.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
Which it's going totally off topic, but I think of like all the other like hobbies and interests I'm into, and they have arguments too, and it's always like there's just human nature, I think, just to complain and be mad about something.
Yeah, we all have good days, we all have bad days, so yeah, absolutely.
Very, very true. Well, James, I want to thank you for coming on. Did I miss anything that you want to cover before we jump off of this?
No, I think that's covered it. But as I said, if people want to try this thing out, github.com/php/pie, just let me know how you get on with it. That's the main thing. And Eric, thank you for having me on. It's been great chatting to you about Pie.
Sweet. I love it. And we'll definitely have show notes and stuff on that when we post this, everywhere we post it. I guess the second thing, if they want to reach out to you or follow you, are you using any social media networks now, or?
Yeah, I'm on phpc.social as Asgrim, and also on Blue Sky, asgrim.dev. So you can reach out to me there. And I'm also on Discord if you ever want to see the Rove Discord, which is discord.gg/Rove. We've got a small community there of folks just chatting about community stuff and tech, open source, home automation, all kinds of stuff. So yeah, thank you.
I love it. Well, thank you again for coming on and talking to us about the project. And everybody, and anyone listening that hasn't tried it, go test it out and see how it works, because this is the future of PHP, and I think it's going to be amazing.